talk about anniversary reactions. But first, I want to tell you a story about a friend. I'll call him John. He's our age, and back in the 1960s, he went to Vietnam like many of our family members did and our friends. It was just after the Tet Offensive, and he got there as a young guy and not quite prepared like many of them for what he was going to see. He came home with some pretty traumatic memories, but he was really effective in dealing with the PTSD. I mean, he looked at his thought processes, he examined the meanings that he attached to different things in the present moment. He had flashbacks, both partial and some full-blown ones. Well, for example, someone dropped a stapler on the table, or he heard a backfire of a car. He would flinch, and it was kind of like these flashbulb memories would happen. But for the most part, he would take a deep breath. He knew how to ground himself, do all those things that we've talked about in the last couple of classes, and he brought himself back into the present moment. So I was kind of surprised one week when John at work was just not quite himself. He was just feeling sort of off. And I asked him, do you have the flu? And he said, no. And I said, well, what's going on? And he said, I don't know. I just had this feeling of doom happening, and I'm feeling just upset. And I look around, and there's really nothing in my life that would attribute to that. So he went about his work. He tried to do what he often did, which was to deal with his trauma by working really hard, because working is one of the effective ways to block out trauma, as we all know. And he did other things like exercise and going out running. He just really tried to keep really extremely active and not allow himself to be sucked into a feeling that didn't add to the quality of his life. So, but it wasn't working. He was getting worse and worse and just withdrawing. And so it was really surprising one morning when he came in and he said to me, I've got it. And he held up his calendar and he said to me, see, I finally realized this morning that this is the day, it's the anniversary of the day that I went to Vietnam. And he took a deep breath and he explained a little bit of it. Of course, he said to me, and I don't want to tell you much about it because he wanted to keep some of those things private. But he did tell me that when he went to Vietnam that first day and he landed and went over to where he'd be stationed, the guy showed him around to his hooch and to the office where he would spend some of his time working. And up on the wall, there was some odd brown stains and other odd things. And John asked him, he said, what's that stuff up there? And the guy looked at him, he said, just, kind of casually off the cuff, oh, that's the leftover pieces of the last guy who had your job. We just couldn't get it all clean. And John was just, well, what he's told me is he said, from that moment on, I was numb until I came home from Vietnam. And I suspect that the guy who was telling me that was pretty numb too, because if he actually allowed himself to feel what he was telling John about what was up on the wall, that he wouldn't have been able to manage being there. So John was, he was so relieved to be able to figure out what was going on. And I thought it was really wise because he said to me, this has been a rough week. And I'm looking back at this time of year, and over a number of years, I have kind of felt this way in February and March. And I never really understood it. I thought maybe it's because it was wintertime and I was waiting for spring. And he said, I'm going to make a point in the future that I'm going to put this on my calendar and I'll send reminders to myself. So when this happens next year, I will be aware of what's going on, and I will look at some of the meanings and feelings I'm having and some of the behaviors. And I'm going to be able to maybe more effectively approach the grief and the loss and the shock and all those other feelings that seem to be coming up in me this week. And he also said, I'm going to tell my wife and a couple other people around me. And I said, well, I'll put it on my calendar too, and I'll remind you when it happens next year. And he was really relieved for that. I was pretty impressed with the way John dealt with it. And because we've looked at anniversary reactions, and I think some people think it's just about weddings, but it's far more than that. Anniversary reactions happen to all of us. And in John's case, and this is my husband, first husband, Bruce, and he was in a hooch, and John went to a place pretty much like that. And they had memories of what it was like to be in Vietnam, what it was like. See over there, there's the boots and the hat on top. They put that out when people died. Uh, Bruce and John and Ray and everybody else that went to Vietnam carried some of those images, and they may have anniversary reactions, knowingly or unknowingly, about some dates or some things that happened. Now, of course, there's some positive anniversary reactions. Today, for example, is November 3rd. And back in 1974, this was the day my son Adam was born. And there you can see us in our little our little cabin in the forest. I gave birth to Adam at home, and he weighed 8.5 pounds. This week, what was kind of curious is that I started having some tightening of my stomach and some feelings of being out of breath when I was walking on the land, and I kind of chalked up to old age. But then this morning, what ended up happening, which is pretty interesting, I woke up right at 6:15, from dead sleep, waking up, and I looked over at the clock and it was 6:15, and I just started laughing because that's the exact time that I woke up in 1974 and started having contractions when Adam was born. It was a great delivery. He was born a couple hours later. So I called my son Adam and I said, guess what happened? And he knew about the 6:15 thing from other years. And he said, oh yeah. He said, welcome, Mom. Happy birthing day. It was delightful. Now, there is some commonalities between anniversary reactions and flashbacks, but there's a big difference. With flashbacks, they're more triggered, whereas anniversary reactions, like what happened with John and kind of what happened with me, they kind of creep up on you. Now, of course, there's some things that are the same. And just, you remember we talked about how with flashbacks, they can be a full-blown flashback, but that's pretty rare. Oftentimes, the flashbacks are partial. You might get a memory or a feeling as like a sight you see, or you might have a sound. You might hear something that's not there. You might have some sensations or smells. And they're mostly triggered by things like that in your environment. You see something, you hear something, you taste something, and it reminds you, and it brings back this sort of flashbulb memory of what occurred at another time in your life. And if you work on it, know how to look at it and deal with it, you might actually get back the knowledge of what occurred, or you might be able to integrate all parts of that flashback. Well, anniversary reactions are the same. You may not necessarily get like I did, waking up at the morning and at 6:15 and realizing, oh my gosh, I'm in labor because it's Adam's birthday. I'm getting the behavior, the affect, the sensation. I had the knowledge. I had it all together. And that's mostly because I knew what day of the week it was, what day of the year it was. Anniversary reactions, like what happened with John, may just be feelings, this odd sense of grief or something occurring. Most of the anniversary reactions are, they're associated with a date or a time of year. And it's not like you're getting a flashback because you see a birthday cake, or you see the time when school starts, you see the sales for paper and pencils. Well, maybe before 1920 or 2020. Now, the anniversary reactions and the flashbacks, they have some commonalities. What ends up happening with flashbacks, as you recall from our other sessions, you might have a flashbulb memory that is triggered by something in your environment. Maybe you saw something, or you smelled something, or you saw a person, or you walked down the street to a place that kind of reminded you of something in your past that was either joyous, it could be a positive flashback, I suppose, or maybe something that was more traumatic. And as we've talked about before, that you may not get the whole flashback, it may be some partial piece of it. You might find yourself reenacting something, a behavior. You might find yourself feeling cold or feeling hungry. You're having a sensation that doesn't quite relate to the moment. Or maybe you might actually have knowledge of, something that occurred, but you have no feeling about it. You have no behavior. It's like you're an observer looking or reading a book. And after a time, if you've done your work and you've maybe had those kinds of flashbacks about that event before, you go, oh yeah, and you put it together, and you can start eventually integrating the memory, the feeling, the sensation, the behavior, the knowledge of that particular event, and you can look at it and assign new meaning. The same thing can happen with anniversary reactions. You may, as it's creeping up on you, have just a partial feeling like John did. He had that feeling that something was kind of impending disaster and doom and gloom, but he didn't have the knowledge of it. So it was pretty confusing for him. He didn't have an anchor in the present moment that let him know that, oh yeah, this is the anniversary date of what's happening, and this feeling, oh, I've got the aha, I know what's going on. I'm going to sit down. I'm going to maybe deal with some of the grief and the sorrow and the loss, and for him, some of the shattered assumptions about the world that happened on that day when he went to Vietnam. What is also different about anniversary reactions is that they're not necessarily triggered by a sight or a smell or a place or an event. They're more likely triggered by times of the year, by birthdays or holiday, a marker day. For example, for me, marker days are Thanksgiving. And it's not that anything bad ever happened on Thanksgiving. It's not that I have traumatic memories related to Thanksgiving, but there were events in my life around that time of Thanksgiving. So when I start smelling turkey being roasted, for example, or I'm seeing pictures of Thanksgiving, I'm not triggered with a memory of something bad, but I have this kind of creeping feeling that something is going to happen. One of the things that's been pretty interesting when they've looked at anniversary reactions is the concept of sunlight. There's this a body of evidence that says, the human body has an ability to be aware of the things in its environment, including how long the day is, how much sunlight there is at a particular time of year. So if you have lived in an area and there's a certain amount of sunlight, and 10, 20, 30 years ago, on that particular day, you had something that was tragic or sad that happened to you. When you have years later, you're walking around and it's about the same amount of sunlight during the day, even if it's cloudy or rainy, your body may remember and have a sense that you are at a time in the year when other things have happened in the past. So for me, with my son Adam being born, there's a certain amount of time of sunlight on November 3rd every year. And I think at some level I was aware of that, because as the sun came up earlier, went down earlier, that my body is kind of remembering that time of year when my son was born. So in sunlight, it might be a trigger, but you don't have any sense or knowledge of why. What Ray and I have done when we got married is we started looking at our own personal anniversary calendars. For example, we probably have anniversaries for birthdays, weddings, births, first dates. And we can be joyous together. We can share those and remind ourselves of those. Oh yeah, I can be happy that we've had other joys in our lives before we got together. But there are these other big question marks, these feelings in our lives that may not necessarily be part of joy. They may be part of some sorrow or loss, or again, like what happened with John, some shattered assumptions about life. So as a couple, we've been helping each other. And Ray says, I'm not better at that than he is, that I seem to remember when there something's coming up year after year that is maybe a traumatic or a challenging time for him. So if I see him being kind of grumpy or sad in the days leading up to that anniversary, I might say to him, hey, Ray, isn't this coming up the anniversary of XYZ? And he does the same thing for me. There is also for both of us things that even after all the years of work we've done on being effective managing of our trauma, we have things that we may not even be totally aware of yet. And as a couple, we get to help each other identify that. So if Ray finds me acting kind of grumpy or withdrawing, and neither of us are aware of anything happening at that time of year, he'll say to me, hey, Shaun, has anything ever happened at this time of year for you? And I'll ponder it, and I may go away and I'll think about it. And I go, oh, yeah, I remember this happened to me at this time of year. And it gives me some context to the way I'm feeling. I'm not necessarily um, assigning the feelings I've had, like emotional reasoning, and we'll talk about that later. But I'm not assigning the feeling I might have to the current situation. And I'll do the same thing for Ray. Now, January, I'll talk about that maybe in another time for you, but January is a time for me when, it's a Ray's birthday. It was my first husband, Bruce's birthday, but there was a couple other really significant sorrows that happened to me in late December, early January in 2011, 2012. And Ray is aware of that. And we are able to give each other some space and support during that time. Now, one of the good things about understanding your anniversary dates, the happy ones and the ones that are maybe a little bit more tragic, a little bit more sad, is that because I'm aware of those anniversary dates, and as you become aware of those anniversary dates, you can create new memories for sad times. Now, I put up some pictures of what happens on Facebook. I don't know if anybody is on Facebook, but you might get those sort of pop-ups saying, you have memories. And if you go into it, you can look on this day, 6 years ago, 10 years ago, however long you've been on Facebook. And if you've posted pictures of those days, you can go back and look at the memories that you created. So I thought about deliberately doing that. And for example, back in, I guess it was 2004, on August 8th, it was a pretty traumatic time for me. It had already been a sad day on August 8th, because back in the 1980s, my dad had died of cancer. But on August 8th in 2004, it was a particularly traumatic day for me. Bruce, my first husband, started having a seizure, and we were alone. Our kids were gone across the world, and I'm up in the forest, and he's having this seizure where we were building our new house. Our previous house had burned to the ground 9 months before. So I'm bundling and getting Bruce into the car because ambulances wouldn't get there in any kind of time that would be effective because we were way far out in the country. I get him to the ER, and the doctor looks at Bruce and does a brain scan and some other things. And then he brings one of those films and puts it up on the light box and points to this mass in Bruce's brain and says, Bruce has a brain tumor. It's a glioblastoma. And of course, and we've talked about this before, Ray and I, that when the doctor gives you that information, your brain just shuts down. And we barely heard anything else except for, I hear him say, and glioblastomas usually die in about 9 months. Take a deep breath, and we're rushing, trying to figure out how do we call our sons from overseas, from up in Portland, from Colorado. What do we do? We were living in a tent at home at that time as we were rebuilding our house. So we're going to need to figure out how to get housing. We need to have an operation done. the world radically changed. I mean, it just pivoted at that particular moment. So as you can imagine, August 8th has some real potential anniversary reactions for me. It is, there's some sorrow from when my dad died. And then of course there's all kinds of dramatic things that occurred in 2004 that eventually led to my first husband Bruce's death in April the following year. What I decided to do after several years of having this kind of buildup of dread, sorrow, loss, and oh my gosh kind of feelings around August 8th is that I was going to deliberately create new memories. Now, one of the great gifts in life is that a few years after Bruce died, Ray and I hooked up and we started doing some things. Now, August is always the time that Ray has traditionally gone motorcycle riding, gone across country. I would find myself motorcycle riding through the Black Hills, going to Sturgis, putting on my leathers, putting on, looking like a biker chick. I found myself with Ray going out to the Yukon, to Glacier National Park in Canada. Last year on August 8th, we were in Minnesota at one of his grandchildren's weddings, and we were at this beautiful horse ranch. I started putting all those pictures on Facebook, but I deliberately put a marker in my brain on my kind of internal calendar that I'm going to create new memories for August 8th, because I was very much aware that I was having anniversary reactions that were significant for a week or 2 weeks before August 8th every year. But I was also going to be able to say, yes, this is the date in the 1980s my dad died. Yes, this is the date my world so dramatically changed when Bruce was diagnosed with a brain tumor. But this is also the day that Ray and I were up in Montana, or we were motorcycle riding, or we were having we were having an electrical outage even in Medford, and we put up all these old kerosene lamps and we sat together and we played music. We created new memories together, and we shared those, and we were able to talk about them. And I would deliberately pull out those things on Facebook or on my telephone or in my computer and celebrate those other memories. These are things that you can do as well too. So what I'd like you to do is get out a piece of paper and put a line down it. And on one side, write some of the positive memories in your life that might give you an anniversary reaction of joy or sense of feeling effective or successful, or something where you did something that was in a new adventure. And on the other side of the page, write down on it maybe some anniversaries that might be giving you a sense of loss, shattered assumptions, a sense of darkness in your life. And what you can do as you start building on this, do some of it now, but start building on this for the future, is discuss these, share these with your partner, your friend, with yourself, put it on your own calendar so that you're aware that when these occur, that you can start understanding maybe some of those feelings that are occurring. Now, as we said with Ray and I, you may not recognize all the anniversaries that could create reactions for you because you're not even aware of the sad events. You may not be aware of some of the happy events. So when those situations occur, you want to jot those down on your calendar as well. Put down things like, this was a tough week, because in a few months, or maybe it might even take a couple of years, you might look back at the pattern. You'll see, whoa, in February, like John did, and part of March, I seem to have a week around that time where I'm feeling kind of off base. I'm feeling sorrow, I'm feeling grief, I'm feeling something. And you can start thinking, well, okay, what happened at this time of year? And we'll talk a little bit later about how these file folders we have in our brains, where you have information about different things. And it seems like sometimes, those file folders are pretty stuck. You don't know where all these memories, thoughts, facts came from. But one of these days, when you start keeping a collection of on your calendar of those off weeks, you might have like this flashbulb or this kind of aha where you pull out this thing from your memory bank, from your file folder in your brain, going, oh yeah, I remember. Maybe your sister or someone else will remind you. Oh, I remember back in, I don't know, 1968, this happened at this time of year. And you'll finally have some knowledge to attach to some of those other feelings that were floating around and rolling around inside of you every time at this year, um, for maybe a few days, a few weeks. And like Ray and I, having those to share with your partners and your family members and your friends will help make sense of a relationship, um, interactions that they may think, boy, you are crazy at this time of year. Or you might think about that with them and you say, oh, okay, well, you know what? This kind of thing that's going on between us at this time of year, maybe it's about a reaction. Maybe it's about a, um, a pending feeling about an anniversary that's occurred sometime else. So it helps you as a couple, as friends, to be able to develop and improve your communication and to be able to assign different meaning to what you might think being, she's just a bee, or he's just he's domineering, or whatever else is going on. You might go, oh, this is about such and such. Let's see if we can change it together now, because it's not about today.